I'm the head of archives at the Missouri Botanical Garden, and I'm a department of one, so bear with me. But today I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon. Together today we are here to celebrate and share the life of former Tower Grove Park Superintendent Bernice Gurney, and by extension the Gurney family and their service and love for Tower Grove Park. For over 100 years, the Gurney family either stood witness or was the guiding hand to the management and development of Tower Grove Park. Through these many years, they and the park served the public to provide a refuge of green space, a showcase of horticultural delights, and meaningful programs, both athletic and intellectual, for the betterment of the citizenry of St. Louis and beyond. To say that Bernice Bunny, as she was known to her friends and family, Gurney, was born for the job to run Tower Grove Park would be an understatement. But first, a little backstory on the place that she would call home, Tower Grove Park. As you're probably aware, or maybe not, Tower Grove Park was established in 1868 by Henry Shaw, and it was opened to the public in 1872. Today is considered the largest and best preserved 19th century garden-esque style city park in the United States. This property was part of the original 760 acres that Shaw purchased in 1842. As you can see in the map here to the left, this is the map of Tower Grove from 1865. It was drawn by Francis Tunica. And so you can see the layout of the park as Shaw intended originally. This map actually resides in the garden archives. It's digitized and it's on the Illustrated History of the Missouri Botanical Garden website. But as you can also see over here, this is the Missouri Botanical Garden as it stood when it originally opened in 1859. That is Shaw's other gift to the city of St. Louis. When Shaw essentially completed the original construction of the garden, he then turned his mind to creating a park. In the garden archives, we actually have one plan where he's combining the two, but at one point he decided to separate out the two. And of course created a separate board of commissioners for Tower Grove Park and a board of trustees for the Missouri Botanical Garden. At the time when Shaw established Tower Grove Park, the park itself was, the majority of it was not within the city boundaries. The city boundaries were roughly about 600 feet west of Grand Avenue. And so he literally took this map, as he did with one for the Missouri Botanical Garden. He had to take them to the Missouri legislature and get approval. And so he does that in 1867. It's approved in 1868. He begins to develop the park full on and opens, as I mentioned, to the public in 1872. The image to the right is actually Henry Shaw and his horse and carriage in the late 1870s in Tower Grove Park. And then up until the time of his death in 1889, he served as essentially the superintendent of the park and also the director of the Missouri Botanical Garden. After that time, the leadership was passed on. In this image here, you can also see, this is the 200-foot strip, as you may or may not be aware, that originally surrounded Tower Grove Park. The idea Shaw had was that homeowners would build houses on the property that they would sign a long-term lease. Long story short, in America, it didn't really catch on. We tend to like to own things outright. And so the one house that Shaw had constructed became the superintendent's house, which is at the Cross Center Drive. Of course, this eventually becomes the superintendent's residence. The idea for this strip, and it became a problem years later, the idea was that the leases that this money that the strip would generate would go to the garden. They wouldn't go to the park. And so initially, in the early days, all the way up until the 1920s, when the city, Shaw had an agreement with the city that they would provide underwriting for the running of the park, the maintenance of the park, but they were essentially giving the park money for roughly about 200 acres, and not the full, I guess it's 279 we consider today. And so this would be in litigation up until the 1920s, and would not be formally resolved until the early 1940s. But during that entire time, essentially the park, it was people, if you glanced at the park, you would assume it's just part of the park because there were no houses on it. But in the long run, it started to cause problems because the park was expected to take care of that strip, but was only getting funding for 200 acres. And so that is something that eventually gets resolved between the Board of Trustees of the Missouri Botanical Garden and the Board of Commissioners of Tower Grove Park. As you can see up here, the park was not originally the shape that it has today. That's another, this was the Thomas Paine property that Shaw tried to acquire for many years but was unable to. This is Magnolia, which would not go all the way through to Kings Highway until the late teens, around 1920. At that time, that's when eventually places in the honor of the Gurneys, like Gurney Court, was constructed. That opens around 1923. And then eventually the street Alfred goes in, and essentially the old garden of Henry Shaw really starts to kind of go away, and the garden, more as we know it, the boundaries that we know today with Alfred and Shaw and Magnolia and Tower Grove, becomes the norm. This was the original Arboretum. Garden today has the Shaw Nature Reserve. We used to call it the Arboretum. The garden eventually, we sold all that property off around 1924 so we can have the Shaw Nature Reserve. But Tower Grove Park, essentially, this is the park that James Gurney would have seen when he took over in 1889 as the first commissioner. But, and so, let's see here. This is an image of Tower Grove Park from Compton and Dry's 1875 Illustrated St. Louis to give you a bird's eye view of what the Tower Grove Park looked like in the late 19th century. As you can mention, you can see the strip here. Actually, in this picture, it actually has a fence on it. And then also just across the street, Tower Grove, or Missouri Botanical Garden. So here's the superintendent's residence. There's a Tower Grove house, which still stands, the museum building, which still stands. And that's about all that really still stands from this picture at the garden. But you can see the rural aspect and nature of what it was like out here. This is where the Shaw neighborhood is today. Construction wouldn't start on that until 1897. The Board of Trustees of the garden started that. And so when you came out here, this would have been an afternoon jaunt. You would have spent most likely the day out here. And so it was very rural. If I remember correctly, it isn't until around 1907 that they passed a city ordinance banning, people used to have cattle graze in Tower Grove Park. So, and so that really doesn't, the city itself doesn't really put the kibosh on that till the turn of the century. It's partly one reason why Shaw had the garden itself walled in. And so it's like I said, the garden had a working farm out here. So it was very rural, and it was a little different. And as I mentioned previously, the Gurney family had longtime ties to Tower Grove Park and the Missouri Botanical Garden. And I'm going to get to Bernice here very shortly, but I cannot do it without telling her backstory because it's all Gurneys. And so this is James Gurney Sr. This is a view of him in Tower Grove Park around the turn of the century. He was originally a native of England, was a graduate of Kew Gardening School, and was working at King's Court in London when he answered an advertisement to become head of horticulture at a garden in St. Louis called Missouri Botanical Garden. And so in 1868, he becomes the head of hort at the garden. As I mentioned, Shaw was still the director of the garden and also the superintendent of Tower Grove Park. But during this time, Gurney most likely would have been advising Shaw on things in the park, while he was also simultaneously being the head of horticulture at the Missouri Botanical Garden. Gurney, as I mentioned, his specialty was water lilies, and he's the reason we have the lily pools in front of the Palm House today. And that is something that he had interest in, but also another family member. I also mentioned one. This is the view. The screen's kind of hard because I'm at the side here. This is what the residence looked like around the turn of the century. And it would have been essentially what the residents and the surrounding area around it, the streets, would have looked like when Bernice was a child. This is an early view in the park of the west entrance. This is probably circa about 1910. As you can see, the lack of development across Kings Highway. The mental hospital will be just out of view over here to the left. It was constructed in 1869. And as you can see, all the roadways within the park are essentially gravel, essentially suitable for horse-drawn carriages. As I'll mention in a moment, the arrival of cars was a challenge for Tower Grove Park. This is a view of course, the east entrance, which is just located over here, then and now. It's like I said, to highlight the nature of the park being horse-drawn and the changes that they had to make it a little more friendly for cars. Oh boy, on the screen it's kind of hard to. Yeah, I can I'll give you my card and send you a follow-up. Sorry. Yeah, probably. Yeah, that was a real problem. This here is one of the earliest images that I have of Bernice. This is a picture of Bernice, her mother Stella, her younger sister Flora, and her older brother James III. In 1897, Stella Kantz of Chicago married James Gurney Jr., who served as the assistant superintendent to his father of Tower Grove Park. James Jr. came over with James Sr. when James Sr. came over to take the job at the garden in 1868. He would have been a boy at the time. So James Jr. also essentially grew up with Missouri Botanical Garden and Tower Grove Park. This is one of the earliest images I have of Bernice. They are, of course, standing on the lily pools in Tower Grove Park. This is a very, very popular thing to do. This image itself actually appeared in the Post-Dispatch in 1908. They're, of course, standing on platforms to distribute the weight out evenly across the lily pad. We had a gardener, horticulturalist at the Missouri Botanical Garden who took care of the lilies one time, and we actually wanted to see how much weight it could hold without a platform. And he did a photo shoot with his 2-month-old baby, and anything more than that was going to be too much. She's holding a cat. Yeah, they're both holding cats. Yeah. And the Gurneys also had dogs, and they were apparently pet lovers. This is another image. This is Stella with Bernice, Flora, and James, and this is Grandma Kirst. While the Stella actually had a lot of great interest in water lilies herself. As I mentioned, the grandmother here, the grandfather was actually, Stella's father was actually rather famous in his own right. His name was Fred Kirst, and he was head of landscape gardener for the South Park in Chicago, and later served on the board, and actually was named chief horticulturalist for the Columbian Exposition of 1893. So Bernice had it on both sides. So it was, and so she had essentially some of the best on-the-job training you could possibly get, and she was getting it actually as a child, because one thing that she would do was she loved to follow her father around the park. And that's how she learned all the day-to-day operations. This is a picture of James Jr. and Stella. He was kind of known for being, he was known for being a little off-putting, and she was known for kind of rounding and fun and kind of made up for it. Over there is a later picture with an older Bernice and James Jr. and Stella and Flora, and that's their cousin whose name's escaped me at the moment. So when James Jr., he eventually takes over running Target Park. This wouldn't happen until 1920. James Sr. Dies. He lived until his death in the superintendent's home. James Jr. actually lived in the home with him. It's more common in the time to have families live in a large house. And so when he takes over in 1920, we're at the beginning of the roaring 20s, and the park and the garden were doing okay, during that time. But it was unfortunate that it would be around the stock market crash in 1929, which would severely dent the founding, or not the founding, but the funding of Target Park and also the Missouri Botanical Garden. Bernice, as a teen during this time, she was growing up in the park. She attended McKinley High School, graduating around 1918. But after she becomes an adult, at some point in time, she does travels the United States, visits both West and East Coast, visits family, and they have extended family in Philadelphia. And at some point, so unfortunately, some of her life, I just don't have documentation for it. And so, but what I am able to figure out, at some point during this time when she's a young woman, she decides to move to Philadelphia. And while she's in Philadelphia, she eventually becomes a secretary. And she worked, and apparently Target Park is never far from her mind. She's still, it's almost as she's expecting to come back. And in one letter that I did manage to find from the doctor she was working for, Dr. Edward Strecker, he states that he has no doubt in his mind that if she went after a career in forestry, that she would be a great success. So apparently she was talking to him in Philadelphia about this park back home, and it was never far from her mind. Eventually, at some point, she is no longer a secretary, and she starts to deal in rare books and antiques. And she would do that up until probably about around 1930. And then it would be around that time that she would return to Tower Grove Park and start to assist her father, who by that time was about 70 years old. So this is an image of the Gurney family in the residence. This is in the 1930s. Here's Bernice. This is James Gurney III, who did not follow in his father's footsteps. He eventually moves to Chicago. And by accounts I can see, he comes back occasionally. But he just apparently wanted to branch off on his own and really had no interest in taking over after his father for Tower Grove Park. However, Bernice was all about it. So this is so I just want to mention James III. He unfortunately dies young. He dies in 1953. Apparently he had some undiagnosed health conditions, and he goes on a fishing trip to Cuba, and unfortunately did not make it back. It would be around this time Also, and I unfortunately don't have any photos of her, June Lloyd. She was the daughter of the housekeeper for the residence, and her mother was named Amy. And after, eventually, I guess, I have no documentation, but Amy passes away, and June stays on, and she stays on in the house and essentially becomes a family member, an extended family member. Her friendship with the Gurneys would last all the way until Bernice's death in 1996. And I'll touch a little bit upon that in the following slide. So upon James Gurney's death in 1943, they had a Board of Commissioners meeting where apparently he said, "I don't feel that great, I'm under the weather," and he went home, and 5 days later he passed. The Board of Commissioners, without hesitation, turned to Bernice. It was pretty much, at the time, Targer Park was facing numerous problems. They had a manpower problem. In 1943, a lot of the men were off fighting the war. But also, the park had they had problems that made it worse, is that employees of the park essentially were making about 20% less than other city employees. And so it made it difficult to retain quality employees here on garden grounds. And so that was something that Bernice had to navigate in the 1940s. But she did it with skill. And I've never seen any instance in my research for this that the Board of Trustees had any issue with her running the park as a woman. It seems, like I said, she was essentially, she knew how to do everything. And that's what they needed. They literally needed that. And so, and like I said, she was more than ready. She was born for the job. So, the big problem that they had here was they were looking for new ways, and this is something that she really jumped into, is they wanted to find ways to engage with youth. And so, since they had a shortage of manpower here working the garden grounds, one of the first things she did as outreach to youth was, "Wouldn't you like to work at Targrove Park?" And so they had a lot of kids. It was open to essentially young teenagers through high school age, and they got a lot of signatures. People wanted to sign up for it. They had to temper their expectations when they found out that most likely they were going to be out picking up trash and not driving the tractors and the lawnmowers. But it was a success, and it was just the beginning of her starting to do outreach towards the youth. These are just some views of Tower Grove Park as it would have appeared at the time when she took over, a summertime and a wintertime view. And another view. And so during this time, and her father had to deal with the same issue, the money that they got from the city did not keep up with inflation. And so while they were getting money from the city, they had to essentially focus on maintaining the park, essentially cutting the grass. And in some instances, they had to cut back on horticultural displays. But one thing that kind of, during this period, made up for it was Bernice doing outreach. Soon, in the 1940s, and it went into the 1950s and beyond, Bernice created new public youth programs at the park that were targeted towards eliminating juvenile delinquency. The idea being that idle minds can be problematic, and so if children are engaged in activities that keep them busy, maybe they might even learn something doing these activities. They wouldn't just be athletic. So she also started programs for adults, These are adults doing an exercise program in the park. These are children in the wading pool, of course. And so one thing that was really kind of fun was that she started doing overnight programs in the lodge. And it's kind of surprising to me, but the lodge was still not electrified. And so when you did an overnight, and they opened it up, it was very popular for the School of the Blind. They would bring a group of blind girls down, just do an overnight. They had printed materials all ready for them in Braille. They would get up in the morning, they would have breakfast, and then they would go on a nature walk in the park. And it became very popular. Apparently, they had so many applicants to stay in the lodge, they had to turn people away. So it was very popular. But the programs that she had set up, they ranged from activities for children like judo, commando courses, like, they were doing the GI workouts, because of World War II. And also did junior achievement, and also featured intellectual activities such as talent shows, book clubs, and book reenactments. This was in addition to the playground and wading pool activities. And so, as I mentioned, the adult classes. In the 1943 Tower Grove Park Annual Report, the first under Bernice, states, "This much is certain. Money appropriated for the support of Tower Grove Park or any public park cannot be looked upon as just so much money for maintenance, labor, materials, equipment, and the like. By far and away, such funds in reality are an investment in the lives of the people the park serves." So I think that's still how the belief of the park today. And so it was a good mission statement, essentially, for her to bring to the park. One thing I did want to point out is that while these programs were started at the time, it would have been at a time when desegregation was starting to happen in St. Louis. This picture here is from the 1960s. Essentially, all these school programs were essentially for whites only. Eventually, that in 1961, the Public Accommodations Ordinance of 1961, the city of St. Louis banned discriminatory policies and required public facilities to be accessible to all regardless of race. Bernice stated during this time that there was, and it was true of the garden as well, there was never any written formal policy that said it was for whites only, but it was like an unspoken rule. And that was unfortunately true across America during Jim Crow. After the and so the programs themselves in the 60s opened up to all and continued to be very popular. This is kind of fun. This is a car meets park. And so early on, Americans' love for the car. It's funny because I was going through articles, dating back to James Sr., and as soon as cars became an invention that took off, people fell in love with them. Kids were stealing them and going on joyrides and running into trees in Darger Park. But long story short, washing your car in Tower Grove Park became a very popular communal activity. And so, you can imagine it's like a weekend car show, essentially. And so it became very popular. It was very popular among men washing their cars. And so it was kind of comical. Letters to the editor started to roll in by So she was the daughter of Dr. George Moore, who was a longtime director of the Missouri Botanical Garden. So she grew up across the street in the director's residence. She briefly actually lived in Tower Grove House, the year that Moore was director in 1912. She, of course, goes on to be rather successful herself as a landscape designer, doing a lot of landscape design for the city of Clayton and also very luxurious private homes in the area. But they here are unveiling a bronze dedicated to her father, who was on the Board of Commissioners starting in 1912. He became president of the Board of Commissioners in 1925 and served until 1949. It's kind of fun because he was the first article I found in the paper, because during his time when he was president of the Board of Commissioners of Targa Park, he had all their meetings in the lodge. And so there's articles in the 1920s saying the park commissioners meet by gaslight. And it's because they're having to light the kerosene lamps in the lodge, even though they could have had the meeting in other buildings with electricity. I guess everybody else, even into the 1950s, really loved that kind of throwback, having the, so they're paying tribute to her father. There's a plaque, of course, to the three Gurneys, Gurney Sr., Jr., and Bernice. And then there's a third one to Henry Shaw. And so that is at the time, the lone dedication to Henry Shaw here on Tower Grove Park grounds. This is in 1958.
Where are these flags?
Wait.
They're Tucker.
Yeah.
Where are these flags?
If I remember correctly, the tennis courts.
George Moore, he was the director of the garden at that time, right?
So at this time, he had just passed away. He died in 1956. And so this is a couple years later, but they were paying tribute to him for his long-term service here at Tower Grove Park. But he was the longest, let's see, I guess it's close to him and Peter Raven are in the race for longest directors of the presidents of the garden. So he serves as president of the garden until 1953. He actually stays and dies in the director's residence in 1956. But as I mentioned, here we have a rare photo of two children that literally grew up with the garden and Tower Grove Park. And it influenced their lives, obviously. Bernice running the park and Mrs. Bakewell becoming a landscape architect. So, as I mentioned, the return of the automobile. So for City of St. Louis, and there were plans that they had drafted, in some cases decades earlier, when the city was, at peak population. It was before the interstates. Traffic was a real issue, and so they tried to create north-south corridors. They tried to do one closer to downtown that was not completed, and they were trying to at one point connect Morgan Ford directly to Tower Grove Avenue and create a corridor that ran all the way up to O'Fallon Park. So these plans had been on the books for a very long time, but in the late 1950s, the City Hall and the Mayor's office decided to move forward with this. And over this time, there was various back and forth in newspaper articles and in public. But what it was is that they wanted to run a depressed expressway through Tower Grove Park. And so it would have directly connected, like I said, kind of more, it would have gone, it essentially probably would have run through the tennis courts, which is kind of hard to believe because they just built them. But it would have bypassed Center Cross Drive and created essentially an expressway. Center Cross Drive would still exist, but there'd be a bypass. Bernice was a champion, stepped up to stop this and led the way. The Board of Commissioners was fully behind her, as well was the Board of Trustees for the Missouri Botanical Garden. The idea of these north-south corridors, the point would essentially become moot because they were living in the moment, and the city of St. Louis was starting to depopulate. The interstates were going in. A lot of these traffic congestion problems would start to alleviate themselves because the population of the city was going to start to drop. And so it was really unnecessary. And so this plays out for many years. And so it really would not be until 1965, the case eventually goes all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court. The argument that Bernice, it's kind of funny because she kept a folder of all the arguments that City Hall made to do the roadway through the park, and she actually literally entitled, I'm reading this directly, the folder was "A Short History of the Dastardly Plot to Violate Henry Shaw's Intent as Donor of Tower Grove Park by Constructing a Highway that would divide the park and pollute the air you breathe." So you can see which side she's on here, and of course she was totally correct. And the argument was that the park is so old that it predates automobiles. So the idea that the park would be used for such purposes was well beyond the intent of Henry Shaw. And so it turned out that the Supreme Court agreed. And so the Supreme Court states that although it may be true as contended that the proposed roadway would enhance the safe use of the park and preserve its unity by preventing its division by surface traffic, it is still a diversion from park uses. The park was not created for surface traffic. It was created for use as the public as a park. And so she won. And so it was quite a success and a feather in her cap, although it was kind of draining after a while, because meanwhile, while she was fighting this good fight with City Hall, she was essentially fighting a good fight at home personally, taking care of her mother Stella. Her mother Stella by this time would be in her late 80s. And so, as I mentioned, June, Bernice, her sister Flora, and her mother Stella, they're all living in the superintendent's residence. And so they essentially set up the first floor, the front room, as a care room for Stella. And so it would become, as I mentioned, or you see, I'm sorry, Bernice would later reflect on this period and state that the place that they so loved, Tower Grove Park, was essentially the one place that was keeping a roof over their head during this period. She was financially drained, and lucky for them, as I mentioned, the place that they so many years dedicated their lives to was essentially providing a shelter for them. And so it's something that she took into consideration and was very grateful for. After the battle over the roadway, Bernice continued with developments and additions to the park. In 1967, they added the comfort station on the west end. 1969, they renovated the sailboat pool. I don't know, did they still allow sailboats in the pool? I'm just curious. They had children actually used to ice skate in the pool as well. And then in 1971, Bernice also renovates the children's playground. The children's playground was originally installed in Tower Grove Park in 1910. Essentially, at the turn of the century, the ideas of playgrounds for children, they rapidly developed into new ideas. I mean, essentially during Victorian times, taking your children to a playground essentially is like taking them to a dog park today. It's like let's go in here and I'll throw you a ball, And so after the turn of the century, that's when we started to get playground equipment. This idea that play should be stimulating, and so she was always interested in the playground, and developing things for children because she played on the playground herself when she was a child. So she helps renovate that in 1971. In 1972, Bernice successfully gets Tower Grove Park placed on the National Register of Historic Places. This process was simultaneously completed. We were doing it over the Missouri Botanical Garden at the same time. And it's one of the steps you go through on the way to become eventually a National Historic Landmark, which the garden became one in 1977, and Tower Grove Park successfully became a National Historic Landmark in 1989. These are some of one of the things you have to do as part of becoming a National Historic Landmark is they do the Historic American Building Survey, or we call it HABS for short. So they came in and they documented all the historic structures within the park. We did the same thing at the garden. As you may or not be aware, a lot of the things designed here in the park were done by George I. Barnett, who was also responsible for Tower Grove House, Shaw's Townhouse, essentially everything that Shaw added during his lifetime to the garden and also here. Unfortunately for the garden is we don't have any of those blueprints anymore. They're all lost to time. So the George I. Barnett, and it's my understanding that most of George I. Barnett's drawings were lost. And so these HABS drawings are documentation of the structures as they exist, and then they kind of become the new blueprints that we can look to when we're looking at these historic structures. So this would have been an outgrowth of the being on the National Register and eventually a step on the way to becoming a National Historic Landmark. Bernice, during her long tenure, was constantly active in neighborhood associations that neighbored the park. That commitment to serve the neighboring area by utilizing Tower Grove Park is not only a place of enjoyment by the populace, but as a catalyst for creating a sense of community, never waned during her tenure, and it was a belief that she carried on for the rest of her life. She announced her retirement in 1975, and after stepping down in 1976, a new superintendent was named. It would be the first time a Gurney was not named in roughly almost 80 years. Over 80 years. Robert Dennison would become the new commissioner of the park, and Bernice made herself available to the staff post-retirement. After leaving Tower Grove Park, she left the residence and moved into a home purchased by June, who I mentioned, and lived there with her sister Flora, who died in 1987, and Bernice would live on until 1996. The Board of Commissioners paid tribute to her by stating, in serving as superintendent for 33 years, you have given more years to the leadership and direction of the park than any other person. Bernice Gurney, you have served Tower Grove Park well. Henry Shaw would be proud of you. You have kept his beautiful, attractive, desirable place appealing to the general public and loved by every generation has been fortunate enough to enjoy its many features. Of course, the bandstand was a long time popular thing. Bernice herself reflected upon her retirement that I think I am trying to say that I loved the park. I loved my job. I loved everything good and not so good that went with it. And I just want to read her own words here in closing. And this is something she wrote, I found in a scrapbook upon retirement. It says, and this is her reflecting on the area in 1976. It says, personally, I'm optimistic about this large, densely populated area the park serves. And although there are some negative factors, they are far from unsurmountable. I think we are in a forward-headed transition period and on our way to preserving all the plus features and solving all the negative factors. Another big solid plus, and personally will always be a drawing card for this community, is Tower Grove Park and the Missouri Botanical Garden. Of course, And quite naturally, I am hopelessly biased, being a third-generation superintendent. But as I stated at the beginning, Tower Grove Park will continue to be a vital plus area for recreation and many-faceted enjoyment, just as the donor Henry Shaw envisioned back in 1868 when he gave the park to the city. As his now famous Missouri Botanical Garden with its priceless fauna and flora collections of beauty and architectural beauty serves as an important landmark of national recognition and enjoyment, and whether passively or actively, I am thinking of Tower Grove Park use by and for the people. In serving communities, one must mention that the various recreational activities available, such as tennis courts, playgrounds, ball fields, wading pool, bicycling, picnicking, ball fields, band concerts, etc., are all conducive to wholesome outdoor recreation activities for the entire family. So this is Bernice sitting on the back steps of the residence in the 1930s. This is the early photo from 1908. This is from 1978 with the new superintendent, Mr. Dennison. And then the final picture of her from the early 1990s. Although she is gone, she will always be part of Tower Grove Park, much like her father and his father before him. And I would like to thank you all for coming today to pay tribute to such a special woman, Bernice Bunny Gurney, who made such an important contribution to Tower Grove Park. And I ask that the next time you walk the park to reflect on all those past and those present, the staff, the volunteers, the Board of Commissioners, the members, who continue to ensure that the beauty of Tower Grove Park will be enjoyed by generations to come, and that it will forever remain a vital place in our society in the spirit of unity, understanding, and solidarity for all. In closing, I'd like to thank you all for coming today.
Any hopes of having the band return for the summer? You think about that? I get probably
Yeah, that I can't answer. I hope.
Yes, our summer concert series will be in full effect this summer.
we're gonna have a band concert.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
What about the one house on Magnolia, just
Oh.
west of Alfred? How did that get there?
So that was, as I mentioned, the strip around the park, and then the Payne property that Shaw was unable to acquire. So when that house was on the Payne property, and so the street did not go through at the time, and so the whole strip would not be officially incorporated into the park until about 1923. And the problem for the park was that the Board of Trustees for the garden wanted to be paid for it. They didn't want to just give it. And so while it was settled essentially in 1923, the financial was not really worked out until, the financial solution wasn't really worked out until the early 1940s. Essentially, Tower Grove Park paid the garden $500,000 for the strip around them over a period of 10 years. But and so when you used to come to the park here and the garden, like the streetcar line used to come down Tower Grove Avenue, the turnaround was over at Thurman. The building is still there behind the apartments. There was the turnaround. Used to drop people off right at the bandstand. But if you went down Magnolia, it essentially dead ended at Tower Grove, or just a little. There was no Alfred going through yet, and so they finally, Tower Grove Park commissioners, the Missouri Botanical Garden, and the city of St. Louis finally came to a solution, because it was all in everybody's interest to make Magnolia go all the way through to Kings Highway. And so they worked with Tower Grove Park, Missouri Botanical Garden, and the descendants of Payne, Thomas Payne owned property, and they came to something that was agreeable. They put the street all the way through. And that house became part, essentially, of Tower Grove Park, even though it was not originally built by Tower Grove Park. And it was included, essentially, in the Strip. And so that house was, like I said, not built by Tower Grove Park. It's a Payne house. And rather than tear it down, they kept it and retained it. Last I heard, they used to rent it. It was a rental. The last time I heard, it was, I think it was years ago now, but there were nuns in it. Yeah. So that's the street. That's why the street's like right there in front of the house. And so, yeah. And that's the difference. Like if you ever go over to the southwest neighborhood, you get around Shenandoah, there's a difference between the neighborhood. There's on the south end of Southwest Garden neighborhood, it's very nice single family homes. But when you go north of that, it's a lot of 2 and 4 family flats. And so that's the property that the garden owned. And we sold that property off, but we never could acquire the Payne property. And so we sold off the Southwest Garden neighborhood so we could buy the property out at Gray Summit for for Shaw Nature Reserve. The reason being is that coal pollution was so bad in the city that we couldn't even propagate plants in the greenhouses. And at that time, the garden had really, we had taken on huge orchid collections, which are very susceptible to air pollution. So we built greenhouses out at Gray Summit for propagation. And for a lot of our shows up until through the 1950s, we would truck them in for the shows and propagate them out there. But we had problems. It was killing trees, coal pollution. After World War II, technology, natural gas furnaces start to be more common. People burning coal starts to decline. And eventually the problem sort of goes away. So yeah, that's tied to the divisions of the properties out here that became the neighborhoods that we know today. As I mentioned, the Shaw neighborhood, that was actually established by the Board of Trustees of the garden in 1897. Flora Avenue used to be Floral Avenue, and it was literally a dirt road that ran from Grand to the front main entrance of the Missouri Botanical Garden, the old entrance. There are images, and if anybody wants any, I have business cards. But I have a website called the Illustrated History of Missouri Botanical Garden that has images of Flora as it used to look when it was tree lined. A lot of those trees in the picture got wiped out by the tornado of 1896. But what it was is that the trustees put in a boulevard, because Shaw really owned the strip that's Flora. It was a woman named Mary Tyler that actually owned most of the Shaw neighborhood. And so, but they called it the Shaw neighborhood because the Board of Trustees kicked it off. They put the boulevard in, they started doing newspaper articles that wouldn't you love to live in this new neighborhood next to a garden and a park? And I mean, yeah, sure. And so, I mean, I personally live in Tower Grove East. So, I mean, So, I mean, the park is part of my life too. I mean, this is my green space. So, and that's what Shaw intended. And, during Shaw's lifetime, most people worked 6 days a week. The garden used to have 2 open Sundays a year, and it was jam-packed. And so, yeah.
But didn't the original entrance to the garden not align with Flora? Didn't they have to do something?
So the original entrance lined up with the old dirt road. And so when they put in the Park Boulevard, the old entrance no longer lined up with the new street. And so it was that way until around 1918. And what they did is they took down what stonework they could repurpose for the new building they were going to build and built a new entrance. That entrance today is what the main entrance was up until they built Ridgeway Center in 1982. So you might remember coming in, you used to walk through the turnstiles, it was open air, Climatron was right in front of you. And so in the late 1980s, around 1990, they enclosed that and turned it into what we today call Spink Pavilion. Yeah.
You had mentioned that the Board of Commissioners didn't have any issues appointing Bernice. But do you have any idea at that particular period of time, were there other women who had a position like that in other places?
No. So even years later, June used to go with Bernice to attend conferences. And this is probably in the late 60s, and she commented that Bernice was the only one. And definitely the only one called commissioner, and so yeah, it was, she really stands out. And it was kind of, when they were going to hire a new commissioner, and eventually chose Dennison, the board of commissioners commented, like, this is the first time we've had to write a job description for this, like, ever. Because they just kept, handing it to the Gurneys. And so, but during that entire time that the Gurneys managed the park was in good hands. And they, saw ups and downs, as everyone did. And the garden did as also. I mean, what changed, I would say, after Bernice, and I see it at the garden too, is that fundraising in general was so much more challenging during her lifetime. I mean, during her father and James Sr., it was non-existent. I mean, you got funding from the city, and essentially, unless somebody gave you a private donation or offered to build something, it was on you. And so, for many years, and it's it's just trying to maintain the place and keep it, and it's kind of fun. So one of the big things that was popular for adults and her activities was things like square dancing and things like that. And so it was kind of fun when they were like, well, we're going to start square dancing. It's really popular. And luckily someone lent us a record player. So, it's just like, so it's just like it's one of those things where you're operating on a shoestring behind the scenes, but you wouldn't know it up front. So, and I think was one of her strengths, is that she literally grew up with the place, literally learned from the best, her father and her grandfather. And as I mentioned, her grandfather was alive for the first 20 years of her life. So, and then she also had her grandfather on the other side. They called him Grandpa K, who, as I mentioned, was famous in Chicago. So, and I have found photos of him. So he lived until 1937. He lived longer than James Sr. on the Grandpa curse. And so I found pictures of him walking the grounds with James Gurney Jr. So, she always, during that time, if she had any questions, I mean, she had some of the best minds of the day to go to. So, and that contributed to her being successful here at Target Park. But yeah, she was definitely very unique and stood out. Yeah, Esley, and then I'll.
The monument that you showed in the tennis building with the roundel to Henry Shaw, and then there was an inscription below, that roundel was taken off the back of the pedestal of the Alexander, the
Humboldt. Yeah.
Monument, and moved over there. Another example of Baby Do.
And somebody actually stole those at one time. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
The side ones.
Yeah. Yes, years later.
This was on the back. That was the only memorial to Shaw in the garden and in the park. And John Carroll, as part of the restoration of the pedestal, moved that back to its original position.
All right.
But what happened to the Gurney part of the memorial, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. Might have a mystery to solve. In the back, then I'll get you. She asked first. Yes.
I have two questions. One was, did Bunny have anything to do with any of the photos, or was that all shot at the very beginning before the park opened in the 70s, 1870s?
So that was all Shaw. Yeah, they're all, if you look at them, they all have years on them. It's like 1872, 1871. So yeah, they're all original features of Target Park. Yeah.
And happen to, I guess isn't necessarily a Bunny question, but
Mhm.
do you happen to have a snippet of any of the history on the specific entrances? Because I know they're all unique in different shapes,
Mhm.
like the different animals, and that might be a very big question.
Yeah, I mean, so there is historical documentation of when things were built. That's something, you know, I could probably produce a document of it. I don't know if Target Park has. Yeah, I'm sure it's all in the historic registry for the. So yeah, so as I mentioned, the application for Esley actually assisted with help getting the park on the a National Historic Landmark designation. He's sitting here in the audience, so he's right in front of you. So yeah. But a lot of this, if you look up the historic registry is online for this. If you search for it, the application that Esley did for the National Historic Landmark designation is online, and all those things are documented. And so, so they, like I mentioned, they did the Historic American Building Survey. So they went to every pagoda and all of the architectural features and documented them. Went into the Targo Park archives, and so those are all the things you do to become a National Historic Landmark. You got to produce the research and documentation. So, yes.
It's gonna become a data center then, right?
Hopefully not. I don't think that was Henry Shaw's intent. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
My question is there a placard anywhere in the park recognizing?
So the placard that Esley was talking about, that was at the tennis center, it featured the 3 Gurneys. Yes. And then it featured George Moore, and then there was one for Henry Shaw. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.